version of the speech because he just gave me the newest one.
Good morning, everyone. My name is atlanta168. I'm the perennial professor of international business at Rollins College and a visiting scholar at Harvard. And today I want to share with you perhaps a different perspective on what I see the role of emerging markets and particularly the role of governance in emerging markets on the ability of these economies to grow. What I thought that we could do is we start by talking a little bit about what we agree on. I think we do agree that the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are going to grow for the near future, and in the long term will constitute a greater amount of the world's purchasing power parity GDP. There is a very famous white paper that was published by Goldman Sachs back in 2003, suggesting that, in fact, the BRIC countries will overtake the G of 7 by 2050, and individually, particularly, China will be among the leaders. And among them, the new ranking of the countries, the world's GDPs, will be China #1 by 2050. The US will be the second largest economy, followed by India, and then you could see Japan, Brazil, Russia, UK, Germany, France, and Italy. So the G of 7 will be, to some extent, dwarfed economically by the BRIC nations, but particularly China and India. So Professor Shett's research agenda, focusing on India and America as the new triangle of trade and investment, I think is appropriate. However, I think that when we just look at these numbers, we're missing something very important based on these projections. We're missing the fact that there is something called governance, that our economies depend on our ability to contract with one another. And our economies are built around certain rules that allow us to trust one another and to continuously trade with one another, even if we don't know one another. And I wanted to give you maybe 3 examples, both of Russia, China, and India, that individually, I think, have their own bottlenecks for sustainable economic growth. And the big question I'm going to ask you today is whether, in fact, countries with bad governance can sustain economic growth and competitiveness. Can we take those trends of growth, economic growth, and just project them in a linear fashion? To just simply say that these emerging markets are going to grow and they will continue to grow and will overtake the United States and Europe. And I'm not so sure that in fact is the case. And I'm going to show you some evidence that I hope that you will evaluate and get a better perspective on what is happening around the world and what will be the future of the world global economy. So I guess before we start, we need to define what it is that we're talking about when we talk about governance. My basic hypothesis is that without improvement in governance, the ability to do things without too much restraints, because, for example, you need to bribe people, because, for example, you don't have good legal mechanisms to pursue your rights, or because you have to rely on guanxi or relationship in order to do business. These governance are really institutions, okay, by which authority can exercise power, that governments are selected, monitored, and replaced. It's the institutions that allow government to be effective at regulating economic behavior. And it's to some extent the ability of consumers and producers to trust the market mechanisms. And my argument here is that if we don't have these basic institutions in place, if they're not firmed up, if it's not something that we can trust, all these countries, all the BRIC nations, and particularly India and China, which is the focus of our discussion today, are going to reach a plateau, a point above which is going to be very difficult to them to move from this production orientation to an innovation-based economies. I don't think that will come naturally to these two countries. And I rely on a very important research project that is taking place now since 1996 by the World Bank, and that essentially collects every available indicator on governance over time and compiles these governance indicators into 6 categories, using what we call factor analysis, using some statistical tools, is able to take all the governance indicators out there, from non-for-profits, from government sources, from Transparency International that measures corruption, and many other sources, and essentially finds that there are 6 dimensions of governance that really matter. This research is ongoing, and I urge you all to go to the World Bank website, Governance Matters, and read more about this research. And these categories include voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. What I want to show you is heat maps, if you will, that show you how the world looks like using these 6 indicators one at a time, where green signifies that the countries in question are in the 75th to above. The yellow is the yellow and the orange they're kind of in the middle, the lower end, and the red markings suggest that they're at the bottom percentile of this governance. And if you could see from this, voice and accountability, you could see that China and Russia and India is slightly better, but they're not doing very well. And what about political stability? Certainly India and Russia not doing well. China is also not great, but better than those 2 countries. Government effectiveness, once again, China, India, Russia are yellow and orange. Same thing is true with regulatory quality. Same thing is true about the rule of law, and of course, control over corruption. So this is not my data. This is data that is collected by the World Bank from a variety of institutions, and I think is confirmed and researched by various people around the world. So if we look at, I wanted to show you some statistics. This is from a presentation that I did in 2008 in Euromed in Marseille. And at that point, we were talking about the Russian economy. And we could talk about the achievement of the Russian economy up to 2008, and where we had such a wonderful economic growth, resulting in GDP per capita of almost $15,000 a year to the average consumer. And then what we found out that, in fact, if you really dissect the data, the reason that Russia has done very well is partly because they have liberalized their economy. They have moved towards a model at some point of a more Western-centric model of economic development. They have fixed some of the problems they had in 1998, and they've had the luck of having a lot of resources, particularly oil. If you look over time at their governance indicators, the same 6 governance indicators that we were looking at, you would see that 2007 is on top, and 1998 is on the bottom. You can see that in almost every indicator, with the exception of 2003, when Putin was re-elected, Russia is doing worse than before. And the paradox was, well, how is it that the Russian economy is doing so well, and yet the governance indicators are not getting any better? So I think one of the reasons that we could really point to very easily in the case of Russia is oil. So I figured, well, why don't we draw the graph of oil prices, and let's draw, and that's, by the way, that's the green line, and let's draw the graph for the Russian stock exchange, which is the blue line, and then let's compare that to the American stock exchange. And I look at over two different periods of time, 1 year and 2 years. And what you can see from these two graphs is that, in fact, the Russian economy mirrored oil, but at the same time has underperformed oil over the period of time. In other words, if you simply invested in crude oil, you would do much better than investing in the Russian economy. So despite the fact that it's linked to oil, the Russian economy has deteriorated in terms of its governance, and in my opinion, in terms of its potential, economic potential. And by the way, of course, 2008 came along, and Russia suffered a major recession, out of which they're still trying to pull out, waiting for the next oil bubble to come in. If you look at the research on Russia, you know, the organized crime, what happens when you have organized crime and the relationship-based economy, and they're faced with a legal environment that is very different? Who are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the law, or are you going to follow the rule of the mafia? You might have kept your eyes on The Economist and some of the news that on the BP deal with Rosneft, and it turns out that the BP didn't take it. They thought they were very clever. They went directly to the government, skipping one of the oligarchs along the way who made their life very difficult, and it looks like Exxon may end up getting the contract. Well, this is what happens when you have relationship-based economies, when you don't have rule of law, when you can't trust the systems that are put in place. And of course that's important, is governance, because in the end government controls legislation. Government controls many of the companies. We've seen what happened in Yukos. Government is supposed to enforce the rules of the game. This is a guy, Eugenie Gontmeyer, who I actually admire, because I read some of his pieces. Actually, he's working in the Russian Social Science Academy in Moscow. And he wrote a piece in that, in English and in Russian, in which he says that the Russian propaganda office has been dismantled, but in fact has been re-emerged by the current government, who brainwashes people and tells them what to think. And I showed that to some of my students at NBU, which is Moscow State University, very clever students, master students, and they wanted to make a counter-presentation. In fact, this slide, as well as the next couple of slides, is the slides that they have made against the presentation. I showed them what happened with the World Bank and the governance indicators. And in fact, they said that we have had many traitors in our country over the years, and this guy is one of them. In fact, if the West had its way, it would take Russia and it would cut it into pieces and make it even weaker.